part 2 of my this chapter, which we're talking about the initiating process groups and the processes within that process. And that is, in part 1, I talked about the project integration management, where we talked about the develop project charter. And in this particular video, I'll be talking about project stakeholder management, where we'll also be talking about identifying stakeholders and what that is all about. I'm going to start this with actually reading from the PMP guide exactly what project stakeholder management is about. It states, project stakeholder management includes the processes required to identify the people, groups, or organizations that could impact or be impacted by the project, to analyze the stakeholder expectations and their impact on the project, to develop appropriate project management strategies for effectively engaging stakeholders in project decisions and execution. Stakeholder management also focuses on continuous communication with stakeholders to understand their needs and expectations, addressing issues as they occur, managing conflict, interest, and fostering appropriate stakeholder engagement in project decisions and activities. Stakeholder satisfaction can be managed as a key project objective. That is, in a nutshell, tells you how important this particular subject matter is. Honestly speaking, this particular subject matter is a slow poison as far as the exam is concerned. It's a slow killer. And if you think small, forget it. You might as well not even bother paying for the exam. You got to think big, you got to think wide, you got to really understand the importance of stakeholders. Majority of the questions are very sneaky. It comes around, what do you do? What do you do if a stakeholder comes to tell you this? What do you do if something goes wrong? Who do you inform first? And all that. You have to make sure that the stakeholder is right at the forefront of your thinking process. Why? Can you actually do a project by yourself? Can you go about and actually do anything in a project by yourself? No. You need stakeholders, and stakeholders are not just decision makers. They're part of your project team. They're part of the people, part and parcel of the project. They are people that can be impacted or perceived to be impacted or have some kind of involvement or influence on the project. So with stakeholders, you need to think far and wide, or wide and far. However you want to put the lines horizontal or vertically. Stakeholders is a very, very, very key subject matter. You need to really, really deep dive. Take your time and understand and think and meditate on the importance of stakeholder management. It's very closely related to communication management, because obviously you have to communicate with stakeholders somehow, somewhere, every time, in many different methods, and hence the subject can be quite confusing. But the bottom line is, you need to speak with them, get in touch with them, communicate with them, and in doing that you need to understand them, isn't it? It's very also closely related to the human resource management subject knowledge area or subject area, and as a result it's key for you to understand. As we get through to those, I will be making references again to stakeholder so that you can remember what we've talked about as far as stakeholder management is concerned. So I have a few questions to ask. It says, what is stakeholder management? We've already talked about what stakeholder management is when I read that particular opening paragraph of the PMP guide. Who are stakeholders? Stakeholders is everybody that can be impacted or in one way or the other have an influence on the project. They include your project team, they include your governors, they include your business partners, they include people that are external, you include maybe your suppliers, they include your colleagues, they include the business units, they include the managers. Anybody and everybody that you can think that has one thing to do or the other with the project, or whatever decision you make as a result of the project is actually going to be impacted. Customers, residents in a location, Anybody, this is just stakeholders. Even the government, the legal department of the government, the Ministry of Finance, anybody that as the project will impact or has a decision towards some kind of influence is a stakeholder. I can't overemphasize how big the subject matter is as far as stakeholders. Why do we need stakeholders? Like I said, you can't even do a project by yourself in the first place. Stakeholders are very, very essential to the success of the project. They can make or break a project. So the bottom line is they're extremely important, and that is why they have to be considered first in any decision-making process, in anything that happens. If there's a change, if there's a delay in the project, if there's anything that's going to impact the project in any case or the other, if the question does not otherwise tell you that the stakeholder has been informed, you need to inform them. That is the answer, no questions asked. Basically, keep the stakeholder informed all the time. The next question I have there is, what do we document about the stakeholders and how do we classify the stakeholders? Now, the process itself, which is identifying stakeholders under the stakeholder management knowledge area in the initiating process, is to identify the stakeholders and to document them. So what do we document about them? There's so many groups, people, organizations, or teams that we need to recognize. And why do we need to know them? And what do we need to know about them? There's a lot we need to know. First of all, we need to know who they are. We need to know where they're located. We need to understand what their play is, what is their role play as far as the project is concerned. Are they those who are going to be impacted by the project, or are they those who are going to be making decisions through the project? Do they have any kind of influence whatsoever about the project? So those two categories, you then filter down into so many things you could think of. What are their requirements, which will be documented initially at a very high level in the project chapter? What do they want? What will make them happy? How do they want the information? How do I get them? What kind of information do they want? How do I communicate with them? What kind of reports do they want? What format do they want the report? There's a whole load of checklists that you can put down, that you can write to say, okay, this is exactly what I want to gather about my stakeholders. It's basically trying to understand who they are. Even their skill set, you want to know what do they know and how much do they know. This would help you in communicating and engaging with them quite successfully. And if, for example, you have a stakeholder who is not quite there may be a reason, maybe because they have no clue of what kind of technology or what kind of project you're trying to do. Knowing their skill set, you may be able to try and help them, to educate them on the benefits of what you're doing so that you can get them on your side. So it's very important that you have a holistic view of what kind of information you need to document about or around your stakeholders. Having said that, stakeholders, for those who actually have some kind of influence or on the project, or could have some kind of influence, are generally classified in these particular categories. What's their power? How strong are they politically? Position wise in the organization. You have the organizational structure in there. What's their influence? Okay, and as a result, when you combine those two, you could have what's the power and the influence of this particular person. How strong are they, and how can they influence your project in the right direction? You also have the interest as a classification in which you can use basically how strong are they, even if they're strong, are they even interested in the project at all? So you have also the power, interest, group that you could think of there. What is their impact if, for example, you have the full weight of the stakeholder behind you? What's the impact to your project? Or whatever they say, how can that impact your project? If they say no, does that mean the end of the project? If they say yes, is anybody going to listen to them or anything like that? Are they pretty much the buck stops right at them? What's their impact? And then finally, you have what you call the salience model, which is probably going to come out a great deal in the exams as well, because it's different and it's a kind of a word that is almost unique to the PMI itself. Salience model is pretty much what's the power, what's the urgency of these guys, and how quickly can they impose their will on the project. Obviously, you're looking at people like chief executives or senior managers who can just stand up from nowhere and put a stamp, a rubber stamp behind your project if it's going slowly, or basically pumping as much money as possible. Or as a matter of fact, tell you, you know what, this is not working, we don't want it anymore, and everything just disappears and goes into thin air, and that's it. So basically, the silence model is the power urgency to impose their will on your project. So if you look at all this, you can put them into a grid. There's an example in the PMP guide about the power interest grid, whereby people that have high power and people that have high interest, right? The power interest with people that have high power and people that have high interest, you need to make sure that you keep them happy. You need to make sure that you keep them satisfied, and as a result of that, you manage them or engage with them very closely and very often. For example, in agile projects, okay, or even in predictive life cycle projects, where basically you just somehow make sure that they are part of the project day in, day out, to make sure that their interest level is high and they keep supporting you. So those are the people with high interest and high power. Whereas those who are not really interested and those who don't have any power, you never know. You don't want to wake the dead. And I think, you know what, I've not been saying a lot of stuff because I'm not interested in this project, but I don't like your project. What do you say? Somehow you need to manage them as well. You don't just put them on the side and get rid of them. You need to basically keep an eye on them to make sure that they're not murmuring things that you don't know, and then eventually at the last minute, boom, come out with a shocker to affect your project. And also you have to keep them informed, even if it means just making sure that they're listed in the stakeholder list, and then when you send out emails or reports about the project, you make sure you copy them in. Whether they respond doesn't matter, but you've kept them informed of what's going on, and then you keep an eye on them to make sure that they are not shifting their position to affect your project, negatively. At the end of the day, as a project manager, what you ultimately want to achieve is success of the project. So that is where classification of the project managers coming into play. Now, when you get all this information, you identify who the stakeholders are, you document or write down a document as to what's about the project, about the stakeholders, their interests, their formats, what they like, what they don't like, their requirements, what's going to, to them, make them happy about the product that you produce out of the project and everything. All is put into a document called the Stakeholder Register. That's simply the output of the initiation part of stakeholder management. Simply identify the Stakeholder Register is pretty much the only output for that particular process. And how do we create this output? Yeah, how do we create this output? What do we need to create this output? First of all, I'll go into the technique in which we used to create the output. First of all, expert judgment. By speaking to people, speaking to the PMO, speaking to colleagues, your knowledge of the organization has been there for a long time, the knowledge of the particular project, you kind of know the kind of people that will be involved. You can use expert judgment to effectively write out, map out, basically write the stakeholder register, put the information about the individual stakeholders in there and their requirements, and you put it on, take it from there. Really, you're not doing it by yourself, but you're doing it with a host of other projects, other stakeholders as well, i.e. people in your project team, i.e. the individual stakeholder themselves, i.e. your manager, if you have one yourself, and even the project sponsor could help you identify the list of stakeholders. And then you then do an analysis of the stakeholders, which is called the stakeholder analysis. And in this case, this is where you determine exactly the power, the influence, the interest, the impact of the project manager. And that way you can know at what point in time you want to engage them. You can't just go rushing at every single stakeholder. You know that, okay, at the beginning, stakeholder influence is very, very high and the risk is very high at the beginning of every project. You need to identify the most important stakeholders so you make sure that you get their buy-in at the beginning of the project. As you later go into execution and you're kind of getting into the results and everything, you find out that there's some of the ones who have been in the background, who have been a bit quiet. You may need to engage with them a bit more and things like that. So the way you actually deal with stakeholders also progresses. So that's a way of basically dealing with and creating the document, which is the stakeholder register. You could also use meetings, which in a way could come out of the expert judgment as well. Facilitation of meetings and having one-to-one meetings, interviews, brainstorming sessions, and all that could also help you in building a stakeholder register. Now, note this, the stakeholder register that is built at the beginning of the project, and that is at the initiation phase, doesn't end there. It is used throughout the entire project and can be modified. Stakeholders come and go. A stakeholder may be with the company at the beginning of the project and may decide to leave to join another company. Are you going to keep emailing them when they're in the other company? No, of course not. So as a result of that, the stakeholder register is constantly updated as well, which as you go through the the planning, which way you go on to plan this, you plan the approach of how you manage the stakeholders itself. When you go on to the execution part, which is where you actually manage the engagement with the stakeholders, and finally the control, where you actually figure out, okay, is this really happening? Control, stakeholder engagement, where you figure out the way we're communicating with this user is not quite what we want it to be. Maybe we need to make sure that we communicate with them in another way. You revise the requirements, you revise information about the stakeholders, you add and take away stakeholders. So in effect, the stakeholder register is actually used throughout the entire process in the project of the project management. Just for the point of note, the integration management process, okay, is the only process that crosses all the 5 process groups in according to the PMI standards, i.e. the initiation, the planning, the execution, the monitoring and control, and the closing project groups. The identify stakeholder initiation the stakeholder management knowledge area under initiation covers, I think, about 4 of that, which is obviously the initiating, which is where you have the stakeholder management, identify the stakeholders. You have it in the planning, where you plan stakeholder management. You have it in direct and manage it up in the execution part, where you actually manage stakeholder or engage with stakeholders actively. You also have it where you control the stakeholder communication, you control the stakeholder engagement, you manage that, but you don't close stakeholders, so you don't have it in the closing process groups. So essentially, that is it. Stakeholder management, in summary, is very important. It's the spine of your project, whereas the communication around them eventually forms the muscles which attach to this, to the bone structure. So look at it as stakeholder as the bone structure of your project. You have communication, which are the muscles that attach to that. Can you detach that? Can you have a bone on its own? No. Can you have communication on its own? No. They are actually an integral part of each other, in which all the other processes, your blood flows, your breathing, your eyes, that's your cost, your risk, your human resources, your procurement, everything then hangs that to make that a full living being, i.e. a living project. Okay, so the skeletal structure, the framework of your project is all around stakeholder management, communication. Those 2 things are pretty much your building blocks of any successful project management exercise that you engage in. I hope you've enjoyed this final part of initiation process group, which has so far covered the project integration management, the initiating part only, which is the developing a project charter, and also identifying stakeholders, which results in the creation of a stakeholder register, which is part of the stakeholder management process or stakeholder management knowledge area. Thank you, and the next videos will now go into the big subject, which is planning. planning is huge. You know, imagine trying to go through every single knowledge area. So that's going to be quite a big video that will contain many parts so that we can touch every single aspect on the planning. We're going to go back again to integration, as you would imagine, and then work our way down to whatever process groups are mentioned according to the PMI standards under the planning process group. It's practically everything. I don't see any knowledge area that you don't have to plan before you start executing. So there you go. And I hope we're going to have fun. Thank you. Bye-bye.